Module 3 of the Sanitation Safety Planning methodology. My name is Leonela Barreto Dillon, and I will be your guide in this module called Identify Hazardous Events, Assess Existing Control Measures, and Exposure Risks. Here, we will be answering the question, how significant are the risks? In this module, you will learn how to identify hazards and hazardous events, refine exposure groups and exposure routes, identify and assess existing control measures, assess and prioritize the exposure risks. Okay, then let's start. In Module 3.1, we identify hazards and hazardous events. This will help us to understand how the exposure to health risk may occur. Before starting with this step, it is important to understand the difference between hazards and hazardous events. A hazard is a biological, chemical, or physical constituent that can cause harm to human health. And a hazardous event is an incident or a situation that introduces or releases the hazard, for instance, fecal pathogens, to the environment in which people are living or working, amplifies the concentration of a hazard in the environment in which people are living or working, or fails to remove the hazard from the human environment. Let's see one example. Hazards in sanitation systems are biological, chemical, or physical. For instance, in a wastewater channel, you will find pathogens such as bacteria and viruses from fecal sources. Toxins and water itself could be hazards. The hazardous event is falling into a wastewater channel, causing effects like diarrhea, skin irritation, or drowning. The team should identify hazards and their associated hazardous events at each step along the sanitation chain. When doing this, consider hazardous events that are associated with existing normal operation of the system, such as faulty equipment, that are potential due to a system failure or accident like equipment breakdown, that are released to seasonal factors such as seasonal behavior changes by farm workers. Also, we need to consider indirect hazardous events like hazards that potentially affect people not directly involved in the sanitation chain, like downstream communities. Cumulative hazards like the accumulation of chemicals in soils, and those caused by climate-related factors. Climate change exacerbates the risks associated to sanitation. It alters the frequency and intensity of hazardous events and creates new hazardous events. Many risks for sanitation come from extreme events and gradual changes to the hydrological cycle. These include more intense or prolonged precipitation, more variable or declining rainfall or runoff, sea level rise, more variable and increasing temperatures, more frequent or more intense storms or cyclones. These changes in the local hydrological cycle creates effects that in turn exacerbates existing and potential hazardous events or create new ones. These effects can be increased flooding, increased erosion and landslides, changes to groundwater recharge and groundwater levels, longer dry seasons periods. Droughts reduce surface water flows, reduce groundwater levels, saline intrusion in coastal or low-lying zones, higher risk of inundation, especially from extreme weather events, higher freshwater temperatures, hot and cold temperature extremes, increased flooding, more extreme winds. Let's think about climate-related causes of new hazardous events. destruction and damage to sanitation infrastructure, declining water supply, impeding function of water-reliant sanitation systems like flush toilets, sewer, or treatment plants, flooding of the on-site system causing spillage and contamination, increased corrosion of piped sewers, proliferation of algal blooms or microbes carried by vectors in water, and many others. Remember that the identification of hazard and hazardous events should be done in each step along the sanitation service chain. For toilets, some hazardous events include: because of wrong design and/or construction, the toilet structure breaks, exposing users to pathogens. Lack of maintenance and cleaning exposes family members to pathogens. One example of climate-related hazardous event is falling into the pit due to reduced soil stability during inundation. An example of hazardous events at the containment, storage, and treatment step include consumption of contaminated groundwater with leachate percolating from pits or septic tanks. A climate-related hazardous event could be exposure to pathogens caused by structural damage to tanks during floods. Hazardous events at the conveyance step include workers are exposed to pathogens during spillage when manual handling excreta collected in buckets. Exposure to pathogens caused by discharge of fecal sludge without treatment to open drains, water bodies, or open ground. An example of climate-related hazardous event is when workers are exposed to pathogens during cleaning of increasing solid deposits caused by reduced water flows in drought periods. An example of hazardous events at the treatment step is workers are exposed to aerosols while manual handling the dried fecal sludge. A climate-related hazardous event at this step is exposure to pathogens contained in untreated sewage during extreme weather events or floods damaging wastewater treatment plants. Hazardous events at the reuse and disposal step include partially or non-treated effluent disposed to surface water exposes downstream populations to pathogens. A climate-related hazardous event at this step is farmers are increasingly exposed to pathogens during wastewater irrigation caused by increased freshwater scarcity. Hazardous events identification might include considerations of their regulatory and policy shortcomings. For example, release of untreated fecal sludge in the environment may be due to the lack of enforcement of discharge regulations. While identifying hazards and hazardous events, we will apply several tools, including desk reviews with field investigation, focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and collection and testing of samples. After you have identified hazards and hazardous events, it is time to refine the exposure groups and define the exposure routes. This has the aim of identifying in detail who might be at risk of exposure to hazards. This helps to determine controls for hazardous events that are specific for each exposure group. Remember that in Module 2.3 we identified broad potential exposure groups. However, we do have new information after we gather compliance and contextual information in Module 2.4 and validated the system in Module 2.5. Therefore, we should be able to refine our exposure groups. We should ask, who are they? How many are there? Where are they? What are they exposed to? What is the route of contamination? Following, the expected exposure routes should be identified. This helps understanding of the risk and also the appropriate control measures. There are 6 exposure routes. Ingestion after contact with wastewater or excreta, through direct contact to the mouth from the hands. Ingestion of contaminated groundwater or surface water. Consumption of contaminated produce that has been grown with sanitation products. Dermal contact with excreta and wastewater. Vector-borne. And inhalation of aerosols and particles. Model 3.3 is about identifying and assessing existing control measures. For each hazardous event identified in Model 3.1, we need to identify what control measures are already in place to mitigate the risk of that hazardous event. This tells us how well the system protects those at risk. What is a control measure? Control measures are any activity or barrier that can be used to reduce, prevent, or eliminate a sanitation-related hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. We need to determine how effective the existing control measure is at reducing the risk of that hazardous event. We need to consider how effective an existing control measure could be, assuming that it was working well at all times, and how effective the existing control measure is in practice. In Model 3.1, we identified a large number of hazards and hazardous events. Now, in Model 3.4, we will establish the risk associated in each event. This model provides a structure for prioritizing the highest risk for further attention. This helps us to identify which hazardous events represent the highest risks. There are different risk assessment methods. However, we will focus on semi-quantitative risk assessments. This needs the participation of several individuals, helping to increase the objectivity of the results. This method requires the SSP team to assign a likelihood and severity to each identified hazardous event. Likelihood refers whether the event is very unlikely, possible, likely, and almost certain. The severity indicates if the consequences of the event are insignificant, minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic. The risk will be given by multiplying the likelihood times the severity. Using a risk matrix, the team arrives at a risk category or score. Climate change and variability can change both the likelihood and the severity of existing and new hazardous events. The likelihood of that particular hazardous event occurring might increase or decrease due to climate change. For example, under drought conditions, sewer overflow frequency might reduce, or under storm or cyclones, infrastructure might be damaged. Although it can be difficult to place firm values on the likelihood for future scenarios, it is necessary that the future likelihoods are considered in the risk assessment. Similarly, the severity of the hazardous events may become both more or less severe. For example, the discharge of effluent to a river is more significant in drought conditions when receiving water levels are low compared with high rainfall events when there is greater dilution. Therefore, we need to draw on climate change projections to consider the potential for climate change to influence the risk. When climate projections are not available, consider how different climate scenarios will affect the severity or the likelihood score. The climate scenarios that result in the largest increase in risk should be prioritized. Great! So we have now completed Module 3 of the SSP methodology. You have learned how to identify hazards and hazardous events, refine exposure groups and exposure routes, identify and assess existing control measures, and assess and prioritize the exposure risks. I recommend downloading the 2018 WHO guidelines and learn more about hazardous events and control measures at each step of the sanitation system in Chapter 3. Also, you should carefully read Module 3 of your SSP manual. In the following lecture, we will continue with the sanitation safety planning methodology, and a specific Module 4. Develop and implement an incremental improvement plan. Thanks for watching and happy SSP.